Glory to Jesus Christ. Welcome back, my friends. You are listening to The Voice of Reason. And on today's episode, I'm going to once again tackle another Protestant objection against Catholicism. This one in particular has to do with the sacraments of the Catholic Church, and in particular, the number of the sacraments that there are in the Catholic Church. Now, this video is going to be directed more towards High Church Protestants. High Church Protestants are basically those Protestants that are more of the classical Protestants, the ones that are more in line with the original Reformers, with Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, all of those guys. They are the top of Protestants. They are the best that Protestants have to offer. They are not like the low church evangelical Protestants that have very, very low theology. High church Protestants are the Protestants that have very high, very sophisticated theology for Protestantism. And they are also the ones that try their best to be in continuity with the first 1500 years of the church. But there is one particular argument that these high church Protestants make that it really makes me laugh. But they make it with a straight face and they're serious about it and they are really sincere about this. They will claim that there are not 7 sacraments, that there are only 2 sacraments, and that those 2 sacraments are the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. And they will claim that the other 5 sacraments are not truly sacraments. They will actually claim that it wasn't until the 11th century that the Catholic Church had the 7 sacraments. Yes, that is the claim that they make. They will claim that we did not have 7 sacraments until the 11th century, and that really there's only 2 sacraments. But let's tackle this objection. Why do Protestants make this objection about the sacraments? So Protestants will claim that there are only 2 sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, and they will claim that the 7 sacraments of the apostolic churches today are in discontinuity with all of the sacraments that we had in the first millennium. Because Protestants will point out that in the first millennium, you get different lists of sacraments, and that some lists had up to 30 sacraments. So why is that the case? That's because the word sacrament comes from the Latin word sacramentum, which just means anything that makes you holy, anything that sanctifies you, anything that consecrates you, right? So the word sacrament in Latin actually has a very it's actually a very broad term, and it can mean a lot of things. So in the early church, it's true that there were many early Christian writers that said that praying was a sacrament. In the early church, many Christian writers said that acts of service were sacraments. In the early church, many Christian writers said that fasting was a sacrament, that giving alms was a sacrament, that venerating fellow Christians was a sacrament, praying the rosary was a sacrament, the devotion to the brown scapular was a sacrament. All of these things they called sacraments. So the Protestant argument is that the Catholic Church is not in continuity with the Church of the first millennium because they had multiple lists of sacraments, not 7. But first, let me just point out how I think it's really silly when Protestants argue this way, because they're trying to argue that Protestantism is in better continuity with the early church and how Catholicism is not in continuity with the early church. But then when they bring up what the church actually believed and taught and did, it's actually like even more Catholic in a sense than like the Catholic Church today, which actually means that Protestantism is actually it's actually further away than the early church, the patristic age, or the first 1,000 years. Like, it makes them look worse. When they bring things up like this, it actually makes them look worse. Because let's say we all want to be like the early church, right? Protestants say there's only 2 sacraments. Catholics say that there's 7 sacraments, but the early church said that there could be up to 30 sacraments. Well, 7 is closer to 30 than 2 is. So even let's just say that Catholics aren't completely right. They're still more right than the Protestants would be. So I just find it a really strange, peculiar argument that they make, because it actually pushes them further away from the early church. But anyway, that's just my thoughts about that. So you might be asking yourself, well, wait a second. Is this true? Were there more sacraments in the early church in the first 1,000 years than there are now? Is it true that there were more than just the 7 sacraments? Protestants will say that there are some lists that have only 3 sacraments, some that have only 4 sacraments, some that only have 5 sacraments, some that have only 6 sacraments, many that have 7 sacraments, but again, there are lists that have up to 30 sacraments. Let me try to make sense of the confusion here. So when you go into the early church, you'll see that a lot of the early church fathers and a lot of the ecclesial writers, when they talked about the sacraments, they weren't all giving an exhaustive list of what these sacraments were. Some church fathers would talk about just these sacraments of initiation, which are baptism, chrismation/confirmation, and the Eucharist. Other church fathers would mention those, but they would also talk about the sacraments of healing, which are reconciliation and the anointing of the sick, or extreme unction. And a lot of church fathers love to talk about the sacrament of holy orders. So what it is, so when you go into the early church, you'll see that different writers talked about different sacraments, but when you take the entire corpus of what they said, you actually get the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. But again, the Protestant concern is that they actually added other sacraments on top of the 7 sacraments. So you can actually have different lists of different sacraments across different writers, but those writers weren't given exhaustive lists of all of the sacraments. And in the cases where certain writers were talking about more than the 7 sacraments, it's because they were operating under the broader definition of sacramentum. So how do we know that the 7 sacraments are the 7 sacraments, that there are only 7 sacraments, not 6, not 8, not up to 30? That is because there is a very specific definition of what a sacrament is. The Catholic Church teaches that the sacraments are those signs by which God communicates salvific grace to the believer, which actually leaves an indelible mark on the soul. So notice that sacramentum is just anything that can make you holy, anything that can sanctify you, anything that can consecrate you. But the 7 sacraments are those sacraments that leave an indelible mark on your soul by which God communicates salvation to you. So you have the broader term, and the 7 sacraments are within that broader term, but those 7 sacraments are the ones that leave an indelible mark that actually save you. So when you go into the writings of the early church, when you go into the writings of the fathers, even when you read the writings of the first 1,000 years, you don't find writers who say that foot washing saves you. You don't find writers that say that giving other Christians the holy kiss saves you. You don't have writers that say that fasting saves you, or that giving alms saves you, justifies you. You don't have writers that say that praying the Holy Rosary leaves an indelible mark in your soul, or that wearing the scapular leaves an indelible mark in your soul. That kind of language is reserved only for 7. And those 7 are baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, reconciliation, extreme unction, holy orders, and matrimony. Whenever those specific 7 things are brought up, that is when these church writers use very specific language, which is the language that, hey, these things actually save you. These things actually leave an indelible mark in your soul. So that is what we're looking for. Go into the writings of the early church fathers, go into the writings of the first 1,000 years, and see which sacraments are the ones that do those things, that leave an indelible mark on your soul. And when you do that, you're going to come to the number 7, because those sacraments do what they do. They leave a mark on your soul. All of these other things, they can guide you, and they can help you, and they can sanctify you, and they can indeed consecrate you, but they don't actually have an ontological, metaphysical change on the state of your soul. But the sacraments that do that are 7 of them, and those are the 7 sacraments of the apostolic churches. So there are other things that you can call sacraments, and it's fine to call them sacraments. And in the Latin West, we actually have very specific terminology. We call those things sacramentals, right? Holy water is a sacramental. The rosary is a sacramental. Your scapular is a sacramental. All of these things are sacramentals. But the word sacrament, we want to reserve specifically for those 7 that leave an indelible mark in your soul, meaning that they actually change your soul. That's what they do. So when Protestants argue that there are not 7 sacraments, when Protestants want to argue that there are more than 7 sacraments according to the church of the first 1,000 years, they are not making that distinction between things that only sanctify you, consecrate you, or make you holier, as opposed to those things, to the 7, that not only do they make you holy, do they sanctify you, not only do they justify you, but they leave that indelible mark on your soul. So that's the language that we should be looking for in the early church. And when you look for that language, you get the 7 sacraments. I feel like I've repeated myself a lot, but just so you guys know, for your consideration, we'll see you next time. Glory to Jesus Christ.